In the quiet town of Oakhaven, Utah, the West family seemed to embody the American dream. Juliana, a charismatic mother, had just moved there with her two children, 7-year-old Owen, who loved dinosaurs, and 16-year-old Isla, a talented artist who protected her autistic brother with fierce devotion. But behind their perfect facade lurked a web of dark secrets, twisted faith, and unthinkable betrayal. What began as a fresh start would soon spiral into a nightmare of manipulation, murder, and the horrifying discovery that sometimes the greatest monsters wear the most trusted faces. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The moving truck rumbled to a stop in front of 8147 Maple Street, its diesel engine coughing before falling silent in the crisp October morning air. The house stood like a picture from a suburban dream catalog, with its pristine white picket fence, manicured lawn still green despite the approaching winter, and cheerful yellow shutters that seemed to smile in the golden sunlight. The mountains of Utah loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season, creating a backdrop that spoke of new beginnings and fresh starts. Juliana West stepped down from the passenger seat of their sedan, her auburn hair catching the light as she surveyed their new home. At 34, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that drew admiring glances wherever she went. Her smile was radiant, the kind that could light up a room and make strangers feel as though they had known her for years. She wore a cream-colored sweater that complemented her warm complexion, and her movements carried the graceful confidence of someone who had always been comfortable in her own skin. To any observer, she appeared to be the epitome of the devoted mother, finally giving her children the stable home they deserved. The driver's door opened, and 7-year-old Owen bounded out with the unbridled enthusiasm that only children possess. His dark hair fell in unruly waves across his forehead, and his green eyes sparkled with wonder as he took in the sight of his new neighborhood. Owen's autism manifested in his intense fascination with patterns and his beloved collection of dinosaur figures, which he clutched protectively in a small backpack decorated with a smiling triceratops. He flapped his hands excitedly, a stimming behavior that helped him process the overwhelming newness of everything around him. The sound of his sneakers hitting the pavement created a rhythmic pattern that seemed to soothe him as he began to explore the perimeter of their new front yard. From the back seat emerged Isla, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to observe before acting. At 16, she carried herself with a maturity that seemed beyond her years, her dark eyes holding depths that suggested she had already witnessed more of life's complexities than most teenagers. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a vintage band t-shirt beneath an oversized cardigan that had seen better days. In her arms, she cradled a worn leather messenger bag filled with her art supplies, the tools that allowed her to translate the chaos of her inner world into something beautiful and comprehensible. The movers began their careful choreography of unloading boxes, each one labeled in Juliana's precise handwriting. As they worked, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by curiosity and the small-town hospitality that Oakhaven was known for. Mrs. Henderson from across the street waved cheerfully while walking her golden retriever, her genuine smile reflecting the warmth of a community ready to embrace newcomers. The postman, an elderly gentleman with kind eyes, paused in his route to offer directions to the nearest grocery store. Juliana seemed to glow under this attention, her natural charisma drawing people to her like moths to a flame. She laughed easily at their jokes, remembered their names after single introductions, and asked thoughtful questions about local schools and community events. Her performance was flawless, each gesture and expression carefully calibrated to project the image of the perfect single mother who had overcome adversity to provide a better life for her children. Owen discovered a small patch of dandelions near the mailbox and became immediately fascinated by their perfect geometric seed heads. He crouched down and began counting the individual seeds, his lips moving silently as he assigned each one a number. This behavior, while endearing to those who understood autism, sometimes drew curious stares from strangers. But Isla was always there, positioning herself between her brother and any potential judgment, her protective instincts as natural as breathing. The interior of the house smelled of fresh paint and new carpet, a blank canvas waiting to be transformed into a home. Juliana moved through the rooms with an almost reverent touch, running her fingers along the pristine walls and imagining where each piece of furniture would go. The kitchen faced east, ensuring that morning sunlight would stream through the windows, and she could already picture herself preparing breakfast while her children got ready for school. Isla helped Owen set up his dinosaur collection on the windowsill of what would become his bedroom, arranging them in the specific order that brought him comfort. The room faced the backyard, where an old oak tree stretched its branches toward the house, its leaves turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Owen pressed his face against the glass, watching as a squirrel spiraled up the trunk, and for a moment, his usual anxiety about new places seemed to fade. As the day progressed, the house slowly transformed from an empty shell into the semblance of a home. Boxes were unpacked, furniture was arranged, and the familiar objects of their previous life began to claim their new spaces. Juliana hummed softly as she worked, a melody that seemed to carry an undercurrent of anticipation, as though she was waiting for something wonderful to happen. But Isla noticed things that others missed. She saw the way her mother's eyes would sometimes grow distant, as though she was listening to a voice that only she could hear. She observed how Juliana would pause in her unpacking to stare at her phone, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as though composing messages of great importance. There was a tension in her mother's shoulders, a barely contained energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface of her calm exterior. During a quiet moment in the afternoon, as Owen napped on the living room couch surrounded by his dinosaur guardians, Isla found her mother in the kitchen, standing perfectly still at the window. Juliana's reflection in the glass showed an expression that Isla had never seen before, a look of fierce intensity that transformed her familiar features into something almost foreign. Her eyes held a light that seemed to burn from within, and her lips curved in a smile that spoke of secrets and hidden knowledge. The moment lasted only seconds before Juliana turned, her expression immediately softening back into maternal warmth. She ruffled Isla's hair affectionately and suggested they order pizza for dinner, their first meal in their new home. But the image of that other Juliana, the one who existed in the reflection, remained burned into Isla's memory like a photograph she couldn't quite bring herself to develop. That evening, as the family sat on the floor of their new living room sharing pizza from paper plates, the scene appeared picture-perfect. Owen had lined up his dinosaurs to watch them eat, creating an audience of plastic velociraptors and brontosauruses that made him giggle with delight. Juliana shared stories about their new neighborhood, painting a picture of the wonderful life they would build together in Oakhaven. But underneath the surface warmth, Isla felt a chill she couldn't explain. There was something in the way her mother spoke about their future, a certainty that seemed to go beyond normal parental optimism. It was as though Juliana knew something about their destiny that she wasn't sharing. A secret that made her eyes shine with that same intense light Isla had glimpsed in the kitchen window. As night fell over their new home, casting long shadows through the unfamiliar rooms, the West family settled into their first sleep in Oakhaven. Owen, exhausted by the day's excitement, curled up in his new bed with his favorite stegosaurus tucked under his arm. Isla lay awake in the darkness of her room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of their new neighborhood, and trying to shake the feeling that their arrival in this peaceful town was not the ending of one story, but the beginning of something far more complex and dangerous than any of them could imagine. Robert West had always been a man of routine, finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of his days. At 38, he possessed the steady reliability that had first attracted Juliana during their college years, when his gentle nature and unwavering support had been the anchor she claimed to need. His brown hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, and his kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses reflected a patience that had been tested countless times throughout their marriage. Every morning, Robert would rise at 6:30, brew coffee in the same blue ceramic mug that Isla had painted for him during a father-daughter pottery class years earlier, and read the news on his tablet while the rest of the house still slept in peaceful silence. He worked as a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company, a job that provided stability but little excitement, exactly the way he preferred it. His world revolved around creating order from chaos, writing clean code that solved complex problems with elegant simplicity. But in recent months, Robert had begun to notice disturbing changes in the woman he had loved for over 17 years. Juliana's warm laughter had become increasingly rare, replaced by long periods of distracted silence, during which she would stare at her phone screen with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She had started spending hours locked away in their home office, claiming to be researching homeschooling curricula for Owen. But the hushed phone conversations he occasionally overheard seemed to involve topics far removed from educational planning. The transformation had been gradual at first, like watching a photograph fade in reverse, colors becoming more vivid but somehow wrong. Juliana's natural charisma had evolved into something more calculated, her smiles now appearing at precisely the right moments, but never quite reaching her eyes. She had begun using phrases that sounded borrowed from someone else's vocabulary, speaking of divine purposes and spiritual awakenings with the fervor of a recent convert. Robert's engineering mind sought logical explanations for these changes. Perhaps she was going through a delayed midlife crisis, or maybe the stress of moving to a new city had triggered some kind of psychological response. He researched depression, anxiety disorders, and even early-onset menopause, hoping to find a medical explanation that could be treated with therapy or medication. But deep in his heart, he suspected that whatever was happening to his wife went beyond anything that could be found in psychiatric textbooks. Their bedroom had become a battleground of unspoken tension. Juliana would lie rigid beside him, her breathing too controlled to indicate genuine sleep, while he stared at the ceiling and wondered when their marriage had started feeling like a performance neither of them wanted to give. When he attempted to reach for her hand or offer a gentle touch, she would recoil as though his fingers carried some kind of contamination. One evening in late November, as autumn rain drummed against their windows, Robert finally gathered the courage to confront the growing distance between them. He found Juliana in the kitchen, standing motionless before the sink, her hands submerged in sudsy water that had long since grown cold. The dinner dishes floated forgotten around her fingers, while she gazed out the window with the fixed stare of someone seeing visions invisible to others. Robert approached cautiously, the way one might approach a wild animal that could bolt or attack without warning. When he placed his hand gently on her shoulder, she flinched violently, spinning around with eyes that blazed with something between fury and fear. For a moment, he didn't recognize the woman he had married. This Juliana had sharp angles where there had once been soft curves, and her beauty had taken on an almost predatory quality that made his stomach clench with instinctive alarm. She spoke to him of missions and purposes, her voice carrying an otherworldly certainty that chilled him more than any argument could have. She told him that some souls were chosen for greatness, while others were destined to remain trapped in darkness, their very presence corrupting the spiritual energy of those meant for higher things. The words poured from her lips like a rehearsed sermon, and Robert realized with growing horror that she was no longer speaking as his wife, but as someone who had been carefully programmed to deliver a message he was never meant to understand. From that night forward, Juliana treated him with the cold politeness typically reserved for unwelcome houseguests. She prepared his meals with mechanical precision, maintained the household routines with emotionless efficiency, and responded to his attempts at conversation with monosyllabic answers that made it clear his voice had become an unwelcome intrusion in her transformed world. Isla watched these interactions with the sharp awareness that comes from growing up in a household where emotional survival depends on reading subtle signs of danger. She noticed how her father's shoulders had begun to curve inward, as though he was trying to make himself smaller and less threatening to a woman who had once sought comfort in his embrace. She saw the way he would pause before entering rooms where her mother was present, his hand hovering over door handles while he gathered the courage to face another rejection. Owen, in his innocence, remained largely oblivious to the growing toxicity poisoning their home. His autism created a protective barrier that allowed him to focus intensely on his dinosaur collection and his carefully structured daily routines without being overly affected by the emotional undercurrents swirling around him. But even he began to retreat more frequently to his room, where the prehistoric creatures offered a stability that the adult world could no longer provide. Robert's sleep became increasingly fragmented, haunted by dreams in which he searched endlessly through empty houses for a wife who had somehow disappeared, while leaving behind only her physical form. He would wake in the early hours of the morning, his heart pounding with a nameless dread, and find Juliana's side of the bed cold and empty. Through their bedroom window, he could sometimes see her silhouette in the backyard, standing perfectly still beneath the oak tree, as though she was waiting for some kind of sign or signal from above. The night of December 15th began like any other. with Robert working late at his computer while Juliana disappeared into her mysterious evening routines. He kissed Isla goodnight and tucked Owen into bed, treasuring these small moments of normalcy in a household that felt increasingly like a stage set for some unknown drama. The weather forecast had predicted snow, and he could feel the electric tension in the air that often preceded winter storms. Around 10 o'clock, Robert received a text message that would later become crucial evidence in the police investigation. The message appeared to come from his brother-in-law, asking him to meet at an address downtown to discuss a family emergency that couldn't wait until morning. The urgency of the request, combined with his growing concern for his family's well-being, convinced him to grab his jacket and venture out into the blustery December night. He was found the next morning in an alley behind Morrison Street, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. His wallet was missing, his watch had been torn from his wrist, and there were signs of a struggle that painted a picture of a man who had fought desperately for his life before succumbing to fatal injuries. The news reached the West household through a phone call that shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. Isla was in the kitchen making Owen's breakfast when the police officer's voice delivered the words that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their lives. She watched her mother's face carefully, searching for the grief and shock that should have accompanied such devastating news. Instead, she witnessed something that made her blood run cold. For just a moment, before Juliana's expression resettled into appropriate devastation, Isla saw relief flash across her features. It was quick, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, but it was unmistakably the look of someone who had just learned that a significant obstacle had been permanently removed from their path. Owen's reaction was pure and heartbreaking in its innocence. He didn't fully comprehend the permanence of death, asking repeatedly when Daddy would come home, and whether his dinosaurs would miss him while he was away. His confusion and genuine sorrow created a stark contrast to his mother's performance of widowhood, which seemed carefully calibrated to meet the expectations of neighbors, police officers, and family friends who came to offer their condolences. In the days that followed, Isla felt as though she was living inside a play where everyone except her had been given the script. Juliana accepted sympathy with gracious dignity, speaking of Robert's kindness and devotion in the past tense, while her eyes remained dry and curiously bright. She made all the appropriate arrangements with funeral homes and insurance companies, displaying an efficiency that seemed almost superhuman in someone who should have been devastated by grief. The funeral itself was a surreal experience that left Isla feeling disconnected from her own life. She sat in the front pew of the church, wearing a black dress that her mother had purchased specifically for the occasion, and listened to strangers speak about her father as though he had been a character in a book rather than the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with algebra homework. Juliana's performance as the grieving widow was flawless, her tears falling at precisely the right moments, while she clutched Owen's hand and accepted embraces from mourners who praised her strength and resilience. But Isla noticed details that others missed. The way her mother's grip on Owen's fingers was possessive rather than comforting, the calculating glances she cast around the crowded church, and most disturbing of all, the subtle smile that played at the corners of her mouth during the final hymn. That night, as the house settled into the hollow quiet that follows profound loss, Isla lay awake in her bed and tried to process the growing certainty that her father's death had not been the random act of violence that everyone believed it to be. The grief she felt was complicated by a growing fear that the woman sleeping down the hall was no longer the mother she had known, but something else entirely. Something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to emerge from behind Juliana's beautiful facade and claim the life it had always intended to live. The insurance settlement arrived with unseemly haste, as though the universe itself was conspiring to validate Juliana's newfound freedom. $250,000 materialized in her bank account 6 weeks after Robert's funeral, accompanied by condolence letters from executives who had never known her husband, but expressed their deepest sympathies for her tragic loss. Juliana received the news with the same controlled satisfaction she might have shown upon completing a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. Within days of the money's arrival, she announced to Owen and Isla that they would be leaving Oakhaven for a fresh start in Colorado. Her reasoning seemed sound on the surface. Too many painful memories, the need for a new beginning, the opportunity to purchase a beautiful home in the mountains where they could heal as a family. But Isla noticed the way her mother's eyes gleamed when she spoke of their future, a light that had nothing to do with grief recovery, and everything to do with barely contained anticipation. Elias Gray materialized in their lives like smoke becoming solid. He was 52 years old, tall and lean with silver hair that he wore slightly longer than conventional, giving him the appearance of an aging poet, or perhaps a philosophy professor who had wandered away from his university and never found his way back. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and they seemed to look through people rather than at them, as though he was perpetually seeing something that existed just beyond the visible world. He introduced himself as a spiritual counselor who specialized in helping families navigate profound loss, a description that made Isla's skin crawl even though she couldn't articulate exactly why. Elias spoke in a soft, measured voice that drew listeners closer, forcing them to lean in to catch every word. His presence filled rooms despite his seemingly gentle demeanor, and even Owen, usually oblivious to adult dynamics, would become unusually quiet and still when Elias visited their home. The man carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His movements deliberate and practiced, as though every gesture had been carefully choreographed for maximum effect. He wore expensive clothes that appeared casual. Cashmere sweaters, Italian leather shoes, watches that cost more than most people's monthly rent, but managed to make his wealth seem incidental rather than ostentatious. Elias claimed to have authored several books about prophecy and spiritual awakening, though Isla could never find any evidence of these publications online. He spoke frequently of cycles and cosmic timing, of souls that were destined to find each other across lifetimes, and of the importance of removing negative influences that prevented spiritual evolution. His words seemed to wrap around Juliana like invisible chains, binding her to beliefs that grew more extreme with each passing day. The move to Colorado took place in early spring, when the mountain air still carried the sharp bite of winter, but the promise of renewal hung thick in the atmosphere. Their new home was a stunning glass and timber structure perched on a hillside overlooking a valley that stretched endlessly towards snow-capped peaks. It was the kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines, all clean lines and panoramic windows designed to blur the boundaries between interior and exterior spaces. Owen was initially enchanted by their new surroundings, spending hours pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows watching deer graze in the meadow below while eagles soared overhead on thermal currents. He arranged his dinosaur collection along the living room's massive stone fireplace, creating elaborate scenes where prehistoric creatures roamed through landscapes that somehow resembled the wilderness, visible through the glass walls. But Isla felt the house's beauty, like a trap closing around them. The open floor plan meant there were no private spaces where conversations couldn't be overheard, and the remote location made her feel isolated from any potential help or witnesses. The nearest neighbors were miles away, their presence marked only by distant lights that twinkled like stars fallen to earth when darkness settled over the valley. Elias moved in with them seamlessly, as though the arrangement had been planned long before anyone bothered to discuss it. He claimed a bedroom on the opposite end of the house from the children, a space that quickly filled with crystals, burning sage, and books written in languages that Isla couldn't identify. Strange symbols appeared carved into wooden totems that he displayed on floating shelves, and the room perpetually smelled of incense that made her throat burn and her head swim with dizziness. The secret wedding ceremony took place at sunset on their deck, officiated by a woman who claimed to be an ordained minister, but whose credentials seemed as mysterious as everything else in Elias's world. Juliana wore a flowing white dress that caught the golden light like liquid silk, and her face glowed with an inner fire that transformed her natural beauty into something almost supernatural. She spoke vows about eternal souls and divine missions, while Elias placed a ring on her finger that looked older than either of them, its silver surface carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance when viewed from different angles. Isla watched from her bedroom window, her stomach churning with a mixture of disbelief and growing terror. The ceremony felt less like a wedding and more like a ritual, complete with burning herbs and words spoken in what might have been Latin or some other ancient language. Owen had been kept inside, distracted by a new dinosaur documentary, while the adults conducted their mysterious business on the deck below. In the weeks following their union, Juliana's behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. She would disappear for hours at a time, claiming to be hiking or meditating, but returning with clean clothes and unscuffed shoes that suggested her activities had taken place indoors. She spoke to Owen and Isla with growing impatience, as though their very presence was an inconvenience she could barely tolerate. Elias began conducting what he called cleansing sessions, during which he would burn specific combinations of herbs while chanting in his incomprehensible language. These rituals left the house feeling heavy and oppressive, the air thick with smoke that seemed to cling to fabric and hair, long after the fires had been extinguished. Owen would develop headaches during these sessions, and Isla noticed that his usual cheerful demeanor was gradually being replaced by a listless anxiety that broke her heart. The children's disappearance occurred on a Tuesday morning in late May, when the mountain meadows were finally beginning to show the first tender green shoots of spring grass. Owen had been excited about a nature documentary that was supposed to air that evening, chattering about the different species of dinosaurs that would be featured while he arranged his plastic figures in anticipation of the show. Isla had been working on a charcoal drawing of the valley view, trying to capture the way the morning light transformed the distant peaks into something that looked more like a dream than a physical landscape. They simply weren't there when the sun set that day. Their beds remained unslept in, their belongings untouched, as though they had evaporated like morning mist when the day grew warm. Owen's dinosaur collection sat abandoned on the mantelpiece, their plastic eyes staring blindly into a room that had suddenly become as empty as a tomb. Juliana's response to their absence was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire situation. When asked about her children's whereabouts, she would smile with serene confidence and explain that they were visiting relatives, safe and happy, and receiving the kind of spiritual education that traditional schools could never provide. She spoke of them as though they were away at summer camp, her tone bright and casual, completely devoid of the frantic worry that should have consumed any mother whose children had vanished without explanation. Elias reinforced these explanations with his characteristic calm authority, nodding sagely when Juliana described the children's supposed adventures with distant family members. He spoke of the importance of allowing young souls to explore different environments, to break free from the limiting influences that might prevent their proper spiritual development. His words had the polished quality of statements that had been rehearsed and refined through multiple repetitions. 300 miles away, in the cluttered warmth of her Phoenix apartment, Patricia Sullivan felt the growing weight of dread settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Robert's sister had always been the stable one in their family, the practical nurse who worked double shifts at the children's hospital and sent birthday cards that arrived exactly on time every year without fail. She had short graying hair that she kept pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and her scrubs were always perfectly pressed despite the chaos of her demanding work schedule. Patricia had called Owen every Sunday evening for the past 3 years, a tradition that had begun when his autism diagnosis made regular communication challenging but not impossible. Their conversations were brief but precious, filled with his excited descriptions of new dinosaur discoveries and her patient questions about his daily routines. These calls had become the highlight of her week, a bright spot of innocence in a world that often felt too harsh and complicated. But the phone calls had stopped abruptly in late May, replaced by Juliana's increasingly elaborate excuses about summer programs and family visits. Patricia's nursing instincts, honed by years of detecting subtle changes in patients who couldn't articulate their distress, began screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. She had tried calling the landline number Juliana had provided, but it rang endlessly without being answered, the hollow tone echoing back to her like a voice calling into an empty canyon. Her attempts to reach out through social media revealed that Juliana's accounts had been scrubbed clean of any recent photographs or posts about the children. The last images showed Owen and Isla from their brief time in Oakhaven, their faces bright with the optimism of new beginnings, but nothing from their supposed new life in Colorado. It was as though the children had been systematically erased from their mother's digital existence. Patricia's sleep became fractured by nightmares in which she searched endless corridors calling Owen's name, her voice echoing back from empty rooms that stretched beyond the boundaries of any real building. She would wake in the pre-dawn darkness with tears on her cheeks and the absolute certainty that her nephew was in danger, that somewhere in the vast wilderness of Colorado, something terrible had already happened to the sweet boy, who had never hurt anyone in his young life. Her calls to local police departments were met with polite but dismissive responses from officers who explained that children visiting relatives was hardly cause for concern. They took her information with the kind of professional courtesy reserved for worried family members whose concerns were probably unfounded, filing her reports in systems where they would likely be forgotten within days. But Patricia's determination was fueled by the kind of love that doesn't accept convenient explanations when instinct screams otherwise. She continued making calls, sending emails, and documenting every suspicious detail in a growing file that she kept in her kitchen drawer. Each unanswered question, every evasive response from Juliana, and all of the strange inconsistencies in their stories became pieces of evidence in a puzzle that she was determined to solve before it was too late. The absence of Owen and Isla created a vacuum that seemed to pull all warmth and life from the world around those who had loved them. Their rooms in the mountain house remained exactly as they had left them, but the silence that filled those spaces was not the peaceful quiet of children who had gone to visit grandparents. It was the profound silence of voices that had been permanently stilled, of futures that had been abruptly severed, and of love that would never again have living targets for its expression. Amelia Gray had spent 43 years of her life believing in the fundamental goodness of people, a faith that had served her well as both a librarian and a mother, but would ultimately prove to be her most dangerous vulnerability. She possessed the kind of quiet beauty that revealed itself slowly, like a watercolor painting gaining depth through careful observation. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a neat bun secured with vintage hairpins that had belonged to her grandmother, and her green eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent decades helping others find exactly what they were looking for, even when they couldn't quite articulate their needs. The Riverside Public Library, where Amelia had worked for 18 years, was a sanctuary of polished wood and afternoon sunlight, its tall windows casting geometric patterns across reading tables, where elderly patrons worked crossword puzzles, and young mothers read picture books to toddlers who giggled at colorful illustrations. Amelia moved through these spaces with the graceful efficiency of someone who understood that libraries were sacred places, where knowledge waited quietly to transform lives. Her desk in the reference section was organized with military precision, every pen in its designated holder, and every reference book marked with tabs that created a rainbow of organizational possibilities. Her colleagues had always admired her dedication to her work, and her genuine care for the community members who sought her assistance. Whether helping a struggling student research a term paper or guiding a recent widow through the process of applying for benefits online, Amelia approached every interaction with the same gentle patience that had made her such an effective mother to her 2 grown daughters. She believed deeply in the power of information to solve problems and heal wounds, never imagining that knowledge could also be twisted into weapons designed to destroy innocent lives. At home, Amelia had created a warm haven filled with handmade quilts, herb gardens that flourished under her careful attention, and bookcases that lined nearly every wall with volumes ranging from classic literature to cookbooks stained with decades of faithful use. The house she shared with Elias reflected her nurturing nature in every carefully chosen detail. From the mason jars filled with fresh flowers from her garden to the photographs that documented family milestones with loving precision. Her marriage to Elias had begun 21 years earlier with all the promise of a fairy tale romance. He had courted her with poetry and philosophical discussions, presenting himself as a man of deep intellectual curiosity, who appreciated her thoughtful nature and respected her professional accomplishments. In those early years, he had seemed to hang on her every word, seeking her opinions on everything from book recommendations to moral dilemmas that he claimed to be exploring for his own writing projects. But as the years passed, subtle changes had begun to alter the dynamic between them. Elias's philosophical interests had gradually shifted from mainstream spirituality to increasingly esoteric beliefs that seemed to exist on the fringes of recognizable religious thought. He began speaking of spiritual hierarchies and cosmic destinies with the fervor of someone who had received direct revelation, his pale blue eyes taking on an intensity that made Amelia feel like she was looking at a stranger wearing her husband's familiar face. The conversations that had once felt like intellectual partnerships became one-sided lectures during which Elias would explain concepts that grew progressively more disturbing and bizarre. He spoke of souls being divided into categories, with some destined for enlightenment, while others remained trapped in spiritual darkness through their own fundamental inadequacies. Amelia found these ideas deeply troubling, particularly when she began to suspect that he had placed her firmly in the category of the spiritually deficient. When Elias began disappearing for increasingly long periods, claiming to be conducting research for his books or attending spiritual retreats, Amelia felt the first stirrings of real fear about the direction of their marriage. His absences coincided with changes in their financial situation that she couldn't quite understand. Money seemed to appear and disappear from their accounts in patterns that made no sense, and when she asked for explanations, Elias would dismiss her concerns with the condescending patience typically reserved for children who asked too many questions about adult matters. The last few months of Amelia's life were marked by a growing sense of isolation that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Friends and family members noticed that she had become increasingly withdrawn, declining invitations to social gatherings and making excuses to avoid situations where she might be asked uncomfortable questions about her marriage. Her daughters, Sarah and Rebecca, both successful professionals living in distant cities, had begun to worry about the changes they observed during their infrequent visits home. Sarah, the elder daughter at 26, worked as a pediatric nurse in Seattle, and possessed her mother's gentle nature combined with a fierce protectiveness toward those she loved. During her last visit in early spring, she had noticed dark circles under her mother's eyes and a nervous habit of touching her wedding ring, as though to reassure herself that it was still there. Rebecca, 23, and completing her residency in emergency medicine, had inherited her mother's analytical mind, but combined it with her father's intensity, creating a personality that could cut through deception with surgical precision. Both daughters had tried to express their concerns about their mother's obvious distress, but Amelia had deflected their questions with the same diplomatic skills she used to handle difficult library patrons. She insisted that everything was fine, that she was simply tired from working extra hours to cover for a colleague who had taken medical leave. Her explanations sounded reasonable on the surface, but they carried an undertone of desperation that her daughters found impossible to ignore. The night of Amelia's death began like any other evening in their quiet neighborhood. She had returned from the library at her usual time, prepared a simple dinner of grilled chicken and vegetables from her garden, and settled into her favorite reading chair with a mystery novel that had been recommended by one of her regular patrons. Elias was ostensibly in his study, working on what he claimed was a crucial chapter in his latest book about prophetic cycles, though the sounds emerging from behind his closed door suggested he was conducting another of his increasingly frequent phone conversations in hushed, urgent tones. At 10:30, Amelia marked her place in her book with a pressed flower that she had been using as a bookmark and announced that she was going to bed. Elias acknowledged her with a distracted wave, his attention apparently focused on a computer screen that cast his face in blue-white light and created shadows that transformed his familiar features into something almost demonic. Amelia's bedtime routine had remained unchanged for decades, a series of small rituals that provided structure and comfort in a world that had begun to feel increasingly unpredictable. She brushed her teeth with the same methodical strokes she had used since childhood, applied the lavender-scented moisturizer that kept her skin soft despite the harsh Colorado climate, and changed into the cotton nightgown that had been a Christmas gift from Rebecca 3 years earlier. Her body was discovered the following morning by Elias, who claimed to have awakened to find her lying peacefully beside him with no signs of distress or struggle. The paramedics who responded to his emergency call found a woman who appeared to have died in her sleep, her expression serene and her position natural, as though she had simply drifted away while dreaming of better times. The medical examiner who performed the initial assessment noted that Amelia appeared to be in excellent health for her age, with no obvious signs of trauma or disease that might have contributed to her sudden death. Her heart showed no evidence of cardiac events, her lungs were clear and functioning normally, and her medical history revealed only minor issues like seasonal allergies and occasional headaches that were easily managed with over-the-counter medications. The preliminary cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest, a diagnosis that satisfied the requirements for paperwork, but failed to explain why a woman with no history of heart problems would simply stop breathing in the middle of an ordinary night. The local authorities, overwhelmed with more obvious cases of violence and crime, filed their reports and moved on to matters that seemed to demand more urgent attention. Elias's performance as the grieving widower was masterful in its calculated authenticity. He accepted condolences with the appropriate mixture of dignity and devastation, speaking of his beloved wife's dedication to her community and her irreplaceable role in his life. He arranged a memorial service that honored her decades of library service and her commitment to helping others, delivering a eulogy that moved attendees to tears with its apparent sincerity and profound sense of loss. But Sarah and Rebecca noticed details that escaped the attention of other mourners. They observed that their father's grief seemed to have very specific timing, manifesting most dramatically when others were present to witness his suffering, but disappearing entirely during quiet moments when he thought no one was watching. His tears appeared precisely when they would have the greatest emotional impact, and his voice broke at exactly the right moments to elicit maximum sympathy from his audience. Most disturbing of all was the efficiency with which Elias began handling the practical matters surrounding Amelia's death. Within days of the funeral, he had contacted insurance companies, begun the process of transferring assets into his sole name, and started making plans that seemed remarkably detailed for someone who should have been too devastated to think clearly about the future. The insurance settlement that resulted from Amelia's death was substantial, reflecting decades of responsible financial planning and the kind of comprehensive coverage that librarians often maintained through their professional associations. $375,000 appeared in Elias's account 6 weeks after his wife's burial, accompanied by letters of condolence from executives who praised Amelia's years of service and expressed their hope that the financial support would help ease his transition into life without her. Within a month of receiving the insurance money, Elias announced his plans to relocate to somewhere warm and tropical, claiming that the Colorado mountains held too many painful memories of his life with Amelia. He spoke of needing a complete change of environment to begin the healing process, of seeking spiritual renewal in a place where the natural beauty might help restore his faith in life's possibilities. His destination was revealed to be a luxurious beachfront property in Belize, a glass and steel architectural marvel that perched on white sand beaches, like something from a billionaire's fever dream. The house featured infinity pools that seemed to merge with the turquoise ocean, master suites with panoramic views of Caribbean sunsets, and amenities that suggested a lifestyle far removed from the modest comfort of a librarian's salary and a writer's uncertain income. The photographs that Elias shared on social media showed him lounging beside crystalline waters, his silver hair gleaming in tropical sunlight, while he raised expensive champagne in toasts to new beginnings. But what shocked his late wife's family most was the woman who appeared in many of these images. A stunning redhead who was introduced as his new wife, someone who had apparently helped him find love again after his devastating loss. Juliana looked radiant in these photographs, her beauty enhanced by designer resort wear and jewelry that sparkled like captured starlight against her sun-kissed skin. She posed with the confidence of someone who had finally claimed her rightful place in the world, her smile brilliant and satisfied as she gazed out over tropical waters that reflected her triumph like liquid mirrors. Sarah discovered these images during a late-night internet search, her medical training having made sleep impossible as she wrestled with questions about her mother's sudden death and her father's remarkably rapid recovery from grief. The timestamp on the wedding photographs revealed that the ceremony had taken place less than 3 months after Amelia's funeral, a timeline that seemed impossible unless the relationship had been developing long before her mother's death. The realization that her father had been living a double life while her mother slowly withered away from loneliness and confusion hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at the glowing computer screen in her Seattle apartment, her hands shaking as she scrolled through images of her father's new life. Each photograph a piece of evidence that suggested her mother's death had been far more convenient than coincidental. Rebecca's reaction was even more intense, her emergency room experience having taught her to recognize when circumstances didn't align with official explanations. She began researching sudden cardiac death in healthy middle-aged women, discovering that while such events could occur naturally, they were statistically rare enough to warrant more thorough investigation than their father's case had apparently received. Both daughters found themselves trapped in a nightmare of suspicion and helplessness, convinced that their mother had been murdered, but lacking the evidence necessary to prove their theories to authorities who had already closed the case. They made frantic phone calls to Colorado police departments, demanding that their mother's death be reinvestigated. But their requests were met with the kind of polite dismissal typically reserved for family members who couldn't accept that sometimes death simply occurred without explanation or justice. Meanwhile, in his tropical paradise, Elias lived like royalty while the insurance money from 2 deaths funded a lifestyle that would have been impossible on any legitimate income. He and Juliana spent their days exploring coral reefs and their evenings dining at restaurants where single meals cost more than most people's weekly salaries. They spoke of themselves as spiritual pioneers who had transcended conventional morality to embrace a higher form of existence, their conversations peppered with references to cosmic destinies and divine missions that justified every decision they had made. But somewhere in the warm Caribbean night, as waves lapped against pristine beaches and tropical birds called from palm trees that swayed in evening breezes, the ghosts of their victims whispered accusations that no amount of luxury could silence forever. Detective Olivia Hayes had spent 15 years learning to recognize the difference between genuine concern and paranoid delusion, a skill that had served her well in distinguishing between cases that deserved investigation and complaints that belonged in mental health facilities. At 41, she carried herself with the confident efficiency of someone who had seen enough human darkness to remain skeptical of easy answers, but retained enough empathy to listen carefully when desperate people brought their fears to her cluttered desk in the Major Crimes Division. Her office occupied a corner of the Phoenix Police Department's third floor, its windows offering a view of concrete parking structures and the distant mountains that rose like ancient guardians around the sprawling desert city. The walls were covered with case files, crime scene photographs, and a collection of certificates that documented her steady progression through the ranks of law enforcement. Her desk held the organized chaos of an active investigator. Stacks of reports, evidence bags marked with case numbers, and coffee cups that accumulated like archaeological layers of sleepless nights spent pursuing justice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. When Patricia Sullivan first appeared in her doorway on a sweltering Tuesday morning in late July, Olivia's initial reaction was the weary resignation that came with another anxious relative convinced that family drama constituted criminal activity. Patricia's appearance suggested someone who had been losing sleep for weeks. Her gray hair was disheveled despite obvious attempts to maintain her usual neat appearance, and her nursing scrubs showed wrinkles that spoke of someone too distracted by worry to notice such details. But as Patricia began to speak, her voice trembling with the kind of desperate certainty that came from intuitive knowledge rather than paranoid speculation, Olivia found herself leaning forward despite her professional skepticism. Patricia's story unfolded with the methodical precision of someone who had rehearsed every detail countless times, checking and rechecking her facts in preparation for this crucial moment. Patricia spread photographs across Olivia's desk, with hands that shook slightly, each image telling part of a story that grew more disturbing with every revelation. Pictures of Owen at family gatherings showed a bright-eyed boy, whose infectious laughter seemed to leap from the static images, while more recent photos revealed subtle changes, a wariness in his expression, shadows under his eyes that suggested disrupted sleep, and a tension in his small shoulders that spoke of constant anxiety. The timeline that Patricia had constructed revealed patterns that sent cold tendrils of recognition through Olivia's experienced instincts. The insurance settlements following Robert West's death, the convenient timing of family relocations, and most importantly, the complete cessation of contact with children who had previously maintained regular communication with loving relatives. Patricia's documentation was thorough and obsessive, filled with phone records, social media screenshots, and detailed notes that demonstrated the kind of desperate attention to detail that came from someone who knew that children's lives hung in the balance. Olivia's initial database searches revealed information that transformed Patricia's fears from family drama into potential criminal activity. Robert West's death in Oakhaven had been classified as a robbery gone wrong, but the case file contained inconsistencies that had bothered the investigating officers enough to generate multiple follow-up reports. The supposed robbery had left valuable items untouched while taking only Robert's wallet and watch, and the location where his body was found suggested a meeting rather than a random encounter with criminals. More disturbing was the discovery of Amelia Gray's death in Colorado, which had occurred with suspicious timing relative to her husband's sudden wealth and immediate remarriage. The medical examiner's report described a healthy woman dying suddenly in her sleep with no apparent cause, a scenario that occurred naturally but rarely enough to warrant more investigation than the case had received. The connection between these deaths became clear when Olivia traced the financial records and discovered that both victims had carried substantial life insurance policies, and both beneficiaries had quickly relocated to expensive properties that would have been impossible to afford on their legitimate incomes. The pattern suggested a level of planning and coordination that elevated these deaths from coincidental tragedies to calculated murders. Olivia's research into Elias Gray revealed a man whose public persona as a spiritual author masked a more sinister reality. His supposed books about prophecy and cosmic cycles were self-published vanity projects with virtually no legitimate sales, yet he lived a lifestyle that required significant income from undisclosed sources. His social media presence was carefully curated to project an image of spiritual wisdom and philosophical depth, but deeper investigation revealed connections to fringe religious groups that preached disturbing ideologies about spiritual hierarchies and the worthlessness of certain categories of souls. The theological framework that Elias promoted was a twisted amalgamation of legitimate religious concepts perverted into a justification for viewing other human beings as expendable obstacles to spiritual enlightenment. His writings, buried in obscure online forums and private social media groups, revealed a belief system that classified people into divine souls, destined for greatness, and zombie souls that existed only to drain energy from their spiritual betters. This ideology provided a chilling context for understanding how Elias and Juliana could justify their actions to themselves and each other. By convincing themselves that their victims were spiritually inferior beings whose deaths served a higher purpose, they had created a moral framework that allowed them to commit murder while believing they were performing acts of cosmic justice. The investigation into Juliana's background revealed a woman whose charismatic exterior concealed a history of manipulation and financial opportunism. Her previous marriages had ended in circumstances that, while not criminal, showed a pattern of extracting maximum benefit before moving on to more promising opportunities. Her transformation from a seemingly devoted mother into someone capable of murdering her own children represented an evolution of sociopathic behavior that had been building toward this ultimate expression of selfishness and cruelty. Olivia's sleep became fractured by nightmares in which she searched endless corridors, calling for children who remained just beyond her reach, their voices growing fainter with each passing night. The case had awakened protective instincts that went beyond professional duty. Tapping into her own experiences as a childless woman who had devoted her career to defending those who couldn't defend themselves. The technical aspects of the investigation revealed the sophisticated planning that had gone into these crimes. Financial records showed a complex web of insurance policies, property transfers, and cash transactions that suggested months or even years of preparation. The timing of deaths and disappearances had been carefully orchestrated to maximize financial gain while minimizing the likelihood of criminal investigation. Communication records revealed the extent to which Elias and Juliana had isolated their victims from potential sources of help or witness protection. Family members had been systematically cut off from contact with the children, friends had been alienated through carefully constructed conflicts, and even medical professionals had been misled through fraudulent documentation about the children's supposed welfare and whereabouts. The psychological profile that emerged from this evidence painted a picture of two individuals who had found in each other the perfect partner for their respective forms of predatory behavior. Elias provided the ideological framework and manipulative skills necessary to justify their actions, while Juliana contributed the maternal facade that provided access to victims and deflected suspicion from authorities who expected mothers to be inherently protective of their children. As the scope of the conspiracy became clear, Olivia felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with cases involving child victims. She knew that somewhere in the vast wilderness of mountains and deserts that stretched across the American West, two children were either suffering in captivity or had already become the final victims of their parents' insane crusade for spiritual and financial advancement. The urgency that drove her investigation was fueled by the knowledge that every hour of delay reduced the chances of finding Owen and Isla alive. Child abduction cases had narrow windows of opportunity, and the evidence suggested that these particular children had been missing for months, while authorities had been deceived by their mothers' carefully constructed lies about family visits and alternative education arrangements. The technical challenges of the investigation were compounded by jurisdictional issues that required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies across several states. The crimes had been committed in Utah, Colorado, and possibly Belize, creating a complex web of legal requirements that threatened to slow the investigation at precisely the moment when speed was most crucial for the children's survival. Olivia's team expanded to include specialists in financial crimes, internet forensics, and international law enforcement cooperation. Each expert brought skills that were essential for unraveling different aspects of the conspiracy, but their coordination required the kind of bureaucratic navigation that consumed precious time, while children remained in mortal danger. The evidence that emerged from this collaborative effort painted an increasingly horrifying picture of systematic deception, manipulation, and murder that had been disguised as spiritual enlightenment and family tragedy. The scope of the crime suggested that Elias and Juliana viewed other human beings as nothing more than resources to be harvested for their own benefit, a level of dehumanization that made their capacity for violence virtually unlimited. As Olivia stared at the crime board that now covered an entire wall of her office, filled with photographs, timelines, and connecting strings that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, she felt the cold certainty that this case would either end with justice for multiple victims or become another tragedy where law enforcement arrived too late to save the innocent lives that hung in the balance. The breakthrough came at 3:17 on a Thursday afternoon, buried in the digital archaeology of a cell phone that had been collecting dust in an evidence locker for 6 weeks. Detective Olivia Hayes sat hunched over her computer screen, her eyes burning from hours of scrolling through data that had initially seemed as meaningless as random numbers in a lottery drawing. The forensic analysis of Caleb Dixon's phone had finally been completed, revealing months of location data that painted a geographic portrait of conspiracy and complicity. Caleb Dixon existed on the periphery of Juliana's carefully constructed new life, a shadow figure whose importance had been deliberately obscured behind layers of misdirection and false documentation. At 39, he possessed the same charismatic features as his sister, but lacked her refined ability to project warmth and trustworthiness. His criminal record showed a pattern of petty fraud and confidence schemes that had never quite escalated to serious felony charges, creating a profile of someone with flexible morals but limited ambition. The GPS data from his phone revealed a story that contradicted every alibi and explanation that Juliana and Elias had provided to authorities. The device had recorded Caleb's presence at the Colorado mountain property on 3 specific dates that corresponded exactly with the timeline of Owen and Isla's disappearance. More damning still, the phone had remained at the property for extended periods during these visits, suggesting activities that required significantly more time than casual social calls. Olivia's hands trembled slightly as she cross-referenced the location data with credit card records, gas station receipts, and hotel registrations that created an undeniable timeline of Caleb's involvement in whatever had happened to the children. The evidence suggested that he had made multiple trips between Arizona and Colorado, each journey timed to coincide with crucial moments in Juliana and Elias's carefully orchestrated plan. The technical analysis revealed additional details that painted an even more sinister picture of coordination and premeditation. Caleb's phone had been in contact with burner phones that were registered to fake identities, suggesting a level of operational security that went far beyond what would be necessary for legitimate family business. The pattern of communications showed intensive planning sessions, followed by periods of radio silence that aligned perfectly with the dates when the children had last been seen alive. Judge Catherine Morrison reviewed Olivia's warrant application with the kind of careful attention that such grave matters demanded. The 72-year-old jurist had presided over countless criminal cases during her distinguished career, but the evidence presented in this particular request carried a weight that made her hands shake as she signed the authorization for what might become the most important search warrant of her professional life. The search warrant was executed at dawn on a crisp September morning, when the Colorado air carried the sharp clarity that comes with changing seasons, and the mountain peaks glowed with the first light of day. The tactical team that surrounded Elias Gray's former property moved with the precise choreography of professionals who understood that they were about to enter a potential crime scene, where every footstep and gesture could either preserve crucial evidence or destroy the last hope of justice for 2 innocent children. The property itself seemed to mock the gravity of their mission, with its continued beauty and serenity. The glass and timber structure still perched elegantly on its hillside, its panoramic windows reflecting the morning sky like mirrors that refused to reveal the secrets hidden within. The landscaping remained immaculate, suggesting that someone had continued to maintain the grounds, even after Elias and Juliana's departure for their tropical paradise. Detective Hayes led the search with the methodical precision of someone who knew that this might be their only opportunity to uncover evidence that had been carefully concealed for months. Her team included forensic specialists, cadaver dogs, and crime scene technicians whose combined expertise represented decades of experience in finding truth buried beneath layers of deception and deliberate concealment. The interior search revealed a house that had been professionally cleaned to an almost surgical level of cleanliness. Every surface gleamed with the kind of sterile perfection that suggested someone had spent considerable time and effort removing any trace of recent human activity. But the forensic team's training had taught them that even the most thorough cleaning efforts left microscopic evidence that could tell stories their perpetrators never intended to reveal. The cadaver dogs began their work with the focused intensity that comes from years of training to detect scents that human senses cannot perceive. Their handlers watched carefully for the subtle changes in behavior that would indicate the presence of human remains, knowing that these animals represented their best hope of finding victims who had been hidden with criminal sophistication. The first dog, a German shepherd named Rex, whose career had included dozens of successful recoveries, began showing signs of interest near the back deck area, where Elias had once conducted his mysterious spiritual ceremonies. His behavior shifted from routine searching to the focused alertness that indicated the presence of something significant. his nose working the air currents with increasing excitement. The second dog confirmed Rex's alert, leading her handler to a specific area of the backyard where the morning shadows fell across ground that looked identical to every other section of the carefully maintained landscape. But beneath the surface perfection lay evidence of disturbance that spoke of digging and refilling, of earth that had been moved and replaced with the kind of careful attention that comes from trying to hide something that must never be discovered. The excavation process began with archaeological precision, each shovelful of soil documented and photographed before being carefully sifted for evidence. The team worked in shifts to maintain their emotional equilibrium, understanding that what they were likely to uncover would test the psychological resilience of even the most experienced investigators. The first discovery came 3 feet below the surface, in an area that had been disguised as a decorative fire pit. The positioning was deliberately calculated to provide an innocent explanation for any unusual scents or soil disturbance that might attract unwanted attention from neighbors or casual visitors. Detective Hayes felt her professional composure begin to crack as the full scope of the crime scene became clear. Her 15 years of law enforcement experience had exposed her to countless forms of human cruelty, but nothing had prepared her for the calculated coldness that these discoveries represented. The evidence suggested a level of planning and deliberate cruelty that spoke to perpetrators who had completely abandoned any vestige of human empathy or moral constraint. The crime scene photographers worked with grim professionalism, documenting evidence that would eventually be presented to juries who would struggle to comprehend how human beings could commit such acts against innocent children. Each photograph captured details that would become crucial elements in building a case that could deliver justice for victims who would never have the opportunity to speak for themselves. The forensic team's preliminary examination revealed evidence of multiple methods of violence, suggesting that the children's deaths had not been quick or merciful. The positioning and condition of the remains indicated that Isla had been subjected to extreme brutality, while Owen's body showed signs of suffocation that painted a picture of terror and desperation in his final moments. Detective Hayes stepped away from the immediate crime scene, her hands shaking as she called Patricia Sullivan to deliver the news that would shatter whatever remained of her fragile hope. The conversation that followed would haunt both women for the rest of their lives, carrying the weight of confirmation that the worst fears had been realized and that 2 innocent children had paid the ultimate price for their mother's descent into madness and greed. The media response was swift and intense, with satellite trucks and news crews descending upon the normally quiet mountain community like vultures drawn to carrion. The story of the discovery spread across social media and television screens, generating a wave of public outrage that demanded swift justice for crimes that seemed to challenge the fundamental assumptions about parental love and protection. But for the investigators who had witnessed the crime scene firsthand, the public attention felt hollow compared to the private grief they carried for children they had never met, but whose suffering would remain etched in their memories forever. The discovery had answered the question of what had happened to Owen and Isla, but it had also raised new questions about how 2 adults could have planned and executed such calculated cruelty against the most vulnerable members of their own family. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains on that terrible day of discovery, casting long shadows across a crime scene that would forever be remembered as a monument to human evil, Detective Hayes knew that the real work of seeking justice was just beginning. The evidence they had uncovered would eventually bring Elias and Juliana back from their tropical paradise to face judgment for crimes that had shocked even seasoned law enforcement professionals, but no amount of legal justice could undo the suffering that had been inflicted upon 2 innocent children whose only crime had been trusting the adults who were supposed to protect them. The extradition from Belize unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of international justice, with diplomatic channels humming with urgent communications between governments that had grown weary of harboring fugitives from American law. Juliana and Elias were arrested at their beachfront paradise on a Tuesday morning, when the Caribbean sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, their luxury interrupted by the arrival of uniformed officers whose presence shattered the illusion of untouchable safety they had constructed around their stolen wealth. The flight back to Colorado was conducted under maximum security, with federal marshals ensuring that the couple who had murdered innocent children for insurance money would not escape justice through any last-minute desperate measures. Juliana sat in her assigned seat with the same serene composure she had displayed throughout their months of freedom, her designer clothes wrinkled from the arrest, but her expression remaining unnaturally calm for someone facing multiple counts of first-degree murder. Elias maintained his characteristic air of philosophical detachment, his pale blue eyes gazing out the airplane window at clouds that drifted past like the souls he claimed to understand so completely. Even in handcuffs, he carried himself with the arrogant certainty of someone who believed that his actions had been justified by cosmic forces beyond the comprehension of mere mortals who lacked his spiritual enlightenment. The Jefferson County Courthouse became the focal point of a media circus that drew journalists from across the nation, their satellite trucks and camera equipment transforming the normally quiet government building into something resembling a movie set. The case had captured public imagination with its toxic combination of religious fanaticism, child murder, and exotic locations, creating the kind of lurid fascination that drove television ratings and newspaper sales to unprecedented heights. District Attorney Margaret Thornfield had built her career on prosecuting complex cases that required both legal expertise and the psychological stamina to confront human evil in its most calculating forms. At 55, she possessed the kind of steely determination that came from decades of fighting for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. Her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that framed intelligent eyes that had witnessed too much suffering to be easily deceived by defense strategies designed to elicit sympathy for the guilty. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a timeline of premeditated murder that shocked even veteran court observers who thought they had seen every possible form of human depravity. Thornfield's voice carried across the packed courtroom with the authority of someone presenting undeniable facts rather than theoretical arguments, each piece of evidence building upon the previous revelation to create an overwhelming picture of guilt that left no room for reasonable doubt. The financial motive was presented with forensic precision, revealing how insurance policies worth over $600,000 had provided the fuel for a killing spree that had claimed 4 innocent lives. Bank records, property transfers, and luxury purchases were displayed on courtroom monitors that showed jurors exactly how blood money had been transformed into tropical vacations and beachfront properties, while the victims rotted in unmarked graves. But perhaps most disturbing was the presentation of Elias's theological writings, which were read aloud in a courtroom that fell silent, as the full scope of his twisted worldview became clear. His classification of human beings into divine souls and zombie souls was revealed to be more than philosophical speculation. It was the ideological framework that had allowed him and Juliana to justify multiple murders as acts of spiritual cleansing, rather than crimes against innocent people. The prosecution called Patricia Sullivan as their first witness, her appearance on the witness stand serving as a living reminder of the real human cost of the defendant's crimes. Patricia's testimony about her desperate attempts to maintain contact with Owen revealed the systematic isolation that had preceded his murder, her voice breaking as she described the last conversation she had shared with a nephew, who would never grow up to fulfill the bright promise he had shown during his brief 7 years of life. Detective Olivia Hayes took the stand with the kind of professional composure that masked the personal toll this case had taken on her psychological well-being. Her presentation of the evidence was methodical and devastating, each exhibit reinforcing the narrative of calculated planning and cold-blooded execution that had characterized every aspect of the conspiracy from its earliest stages to its final bloody conclusion. The forensic testimony was presented with clinical precision, describing the crime scene discoveries in language that was necessarily graphic, but delivered with the respect that the young victims deserved. The medical examiner's findings painted a picture of children who had suffered terribly in their final moments, their deaths serving no purpose beyond the financial gain of adults who had betrayed the most fundamental obligations of parenthood and marriage. Caleb Dixon's testimony as a cooperating witness provided the final pieces of the prosecution's puzzle. His detailed account of his role in the murders delivered with the flat affect of someone who had made peace with spending the rest of his life in prison. His description of Juliana's transformation from loving mother to calculating killer was particularly chilling, revealing how completely she had abandoned any vestige of maternal instinct in service of her twisted spiritual beliefs and insatiable greed. The defense team, led by veteran criminal attorney James Whitmore, faced the nearly impossible task of creating reasonable doubt in the face of overwhelming physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. Their strategy centered on claims of mental illness and religious delusion, arguing that their clients had been so completely consumed by fanatical beliefs that they could not be held legally responsible for their actions. Whitmore's opening statement attempted to portray Juliana and Elias as victims of their own psychological disorders, individuals whose grasp on reality had become so tenuous that they genuinely believed their murders were acts of divine service rather than crimes against innocent children. The defense called psychiatrists, who testified about various forms of mental illness that could theoretically explain the defendant's behavior. But their expert opinions struggled to overcome the evidence of careful planning and deliberate concealment that characterized every aspect of the conspiracy. Juliana's testimony in her own defense became one of the most disturbing moments in a trial already filled with horrific revelations. She spoke with the same serene confidence that had once charmed neighbors and fooled investigators, describing her children's deaths as necessary sacrifices that had freed their souls from earthly suffering and allowed them to ascend to a higher plane of existence. Her complete lack of remorse was evident in every word she spoke, her beautiful face animated by the kind of fanatical certainty that had driven crusades and inquisitions throughout human history. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the prosecution's characterization of her as a murderer, insisting that she had performed acts of mercy that had spared Owen and Isla from lives of spiritual darkness and inevitable damnation. Elias's testimony was equally chilling in its combination of intellectual sophistication and moral bankruptcy. He used the witness stand as a platform for expounding upon his theological theories, explaining in detail how his classification system for human souls provided divine justification for what others might view as murder. His pale eyes blazed with the intensity of someone who believed himself to be a prophet, delivering sacred truth to an unworthy audience. The jury deliberation lasted 3 days, during which the 12 citizens who had been entrusted with determining justice struggled to comprehend how 2 seemingly intelligent adults could have committed such unspeakable acts against innocent children. The foreman, a retired teacher named William Chen, later described the deliberation process as the most difficult experience of his 72 years, requiring them to confront forms of evil that challenged their fundamental assumptions about human nature. The guilty verdicts were read in a courtroom packed with media representatives, family members, and curious observers who had followed the case with the kind of morbid fascination that surrounded trials involving the most heinous crimes. Juliana's face remained impassive as the judge pronounced her guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, her expression suggesting that she viewed the proceedings as a meaningless ritual performed by people who lacked the spiritual sophistication to understand her true calling. Elias responded to his convictions with the same philosophical detachment he had maintained throughout the trial, nodding slightly as though the jury had confirmed conclusions he had reached through his own superior wisdom. Even facing multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, he seemed to believe that his actions would ultimately be vindicated by cosmic forces that operated beyond the comprehension of earthly legal systems. The sentencing hearing provided family members with their only opportunity to address the defendants directly, creating some of the most emotionally powerful moments in a trial already saturated with grief and outrage. Patricia Sullivan's victim impact statement was delivered through tears that had been building for months of sleepless nights and unanswered questions, her voice carrying across the courtroom with the authority of someone speaking for a child who would never have the chance to grow up and speak for himself. Sarah and Rebecca Gray, representing their murdered mother Amelia, spoke with the controlled fury of daughters who had watched their father's lies unravel to reveal a monster who had destroyed everything they had once believed about family and love. Their words painted a picture of a woman who had devoted her life to helping others, only to be murdered by the man who had promised to cherish and protect her until death parted them naturally rather than violently. Judge Harold Morrison, a veteran of 30 years on the bench who had presided over countless criminal cases, delivered sentences that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the complete absence of any mitigating factors that might have suggested the possibility of rehabilitation. 4 consecutive life sentences without parole ensured that Juliana and Elias would spend the remainder of their natural lives in prison, their freedom permanently forfeited as payment for the innocent lives they had stolen in service of their twisted beliefs and insatiable greed. The courthouse steps became a staging area for media interviews and family statements that attempted to provide some sense of closure for a case that had captivated public attention for months. But for those who had known and loved the victims, no amount of legal justice could restore the lives that had been lost or heal the wounds that would never fully close. Detective Olivia Hayes stood in the parking lot outside the courthouse as the media circus began to disperse, her 15-year career in law enforcement having taught her that successful prosecutions provided satisfaction rather than celebration when the victims were children who would never grow up to realize their potential. The case had taken a toll on her psychological well-being that would require months of therapy to address, but she felt the grim satisfaction of knowing that 2 predators had been permanently removed from a world where they could no longer harm innocent people. Patricia Sullivan returned to her Phoenix apartment carrying the bittersweet knowledge that justice had been served, but that Owen would never again call her on Sunday evenings to share his excitement about dinosaur documentaries and new additions to his beloved collection. Her grief had evolved from desperate hope to confirmed loss, but the trial had at least provided answers to questions that had tormented her during the months when she had been dismissed as a paranoid relative, rather than a concerned aunt whose instincts had been tragically accurate. The media attention gradually faded as newer scandals and tragedies claimed public interest, but the case left lasting impacts on everyone who had been touched by its revelations about the depths of human evil that could hide behind facades of spiritual enlightenment and parental devotion. The story served as a stark reminder that faith and religious conviction, when twisted by narcissism and greed, could become weapons capable of justifying the most horrific acts against the most vulnerable members of society. In quiet moments during the years that followed, those who had fought for justice in this case would reflect on the terrible price that had been paid by 4 innocent people, whose only crimes had been trusting adults who had betrayed every obligation of love and protection. The case had revealed uncomfortable truths about the capacity for evil that exists within ordinary-seeming people, and the devastating consequences that follow when moral constraints are abandoned in favor of self-serving ideologies that place personal desires above the fundamental value of human life. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.